Welcome to The Civil War's Legacy, an interactive U.S. history tutorial for students like you. You probably know that the Civil War transformed America like no other event in our nation's history. But do you know the circumstances of the war's end and what impact it had on generations of Americans to come? By the end of this tutorial, you'll review what the Civil War was and when and where it took place. You'll better understand how and why the war ended when it did, and you'll explore the vast political and social consequences of America's greatest conflict. The Civil War, America's bloodiest conflict, raged for 4 long years, from 1861 to 1865. During that time, our nation was divided into two: the United States, or Union, seen here in blue, and the Confederate States, or Confederacy, seen here in red. A civil war is different from other wars because the people of a nation are fighting one another instead of a foreign enemy. People often talk about the Civil War in terms of North versus South, but that isn't entirely accurate. Not all the states considered Southern joined the Confederacy. Several remained loyal to the United States. For this reason, we'll describe the war in terms of the Union versus the Confederacy. Let's compare the two sides so you know the basics. 25 states made up the Union during the war years. These states had a population of about 21 million people at the time. Most of the industry and manufacturing in the U.S. was centered in these states. Abraham Lincoln led the Union through the entire war as president and commander-in-chief. Many generals led the Union war effort, but the best known and the one who brought the war to a successful conclusion was Ulysses S. Grant. 11 states made up the Confederacy. These states had a far smaller population of about 9 million, but more than a third of those people were African American slaves. Compared to the Union, the Confederacy was far more rural and agricultural. The Confederacy elected its own president, Jefferson Davis. Its most famous and successful general was Robert E. Lee. The Civil War began after South Carolina led 10 other states in seceding from the Union. This means that they attempted to leave the United States to form their own nation. President Lincoln was determined to prevent secession and restore the Union. After Confederates attacked Union forces at Fort Sumter, Lincoln raised an army to put down the rebellion, and the war began. This probably isn't a spoiler, but the Union won the Civil War. This outcome doesn't seem surprising when you consider that the northern states had far superior amounts of soldiers, money, and supplies, as well as the determination to fight the war to its conclusion. However, the first 2 years of the war were indecisive. Union armies won most battles in the West, but in the more populated East, Robert E. Lee won several key battles that earned him a reputation as a bold, daring general who might be able to pull off an upset for the Confederacy. In 1862, more than a year into the war, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This presidential order declared the slaves in the rebel Confederate states to be free. Lincoln had once claimed that he would not abolish slavery as president, but he had come to view abolition as a necessary war effort to defeat the Confederacy. This event changed the character of the war. The Civil War was no longer just being waged to fight secession and restore the Union. If the North won, the United States would emerge from the war as a very different nation, one without slavery. But to make the changes permanent, the Union needed to turn the tide of the war and win some major battles. For the first 3 days of July 1863 in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the largest and most famous battle of the Civil War raged. Here, the Union scored the decisive victory it badly needed. It was one of the turning points of the war. That fall, Abraham Lincoln was invited to deliver a speech that would dedicate a new cemetery for the soldiers who died in Gettysburg. You've probably heard of the Gettysburg Address that Lincoln wrote for the occasion. It's one of the most famous speeches of all time. Here's the short speech in its entirety. 67 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. In a speech that took him less than 2 minutes to read out loud, Lincoln gave new meaning to the war that still raged in his country. The Union wouldn't just survive the war, he said, it would be transformed. A new birth of freedom would give meaning to the sacrifice of the soldiers that had bravely died at Gettysburg and other battles. Gettysburg wasn't the Union's only major victory in 1863. On the 4th of July, the very day Robert E. Lee's troops retreated from Pennsylvania, Confederate forces surrendered at Vicksburg, Mississippi. Vicksburg was a stronghold on the Mississippi River, and conquering it allowed the Union to control the river and split the Confederacy in two. The general who triumphed at Vicksburg was General Ulysses S. Grant, who Lincoln soon promoted to the head of all Union armies. In 1864 and 1865, Grant pursued an aggressive campaign in the East that weakened Lee and his army and made Union victory all but inevitable. Grant's hard-hitting strategy worked. On April 9, 1865, General Lee and his Confederates became weakened and trapped with no clear way to keep fighting. At the small Virginia town of Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered to Grant, effectively ending the war. The surrender terms were the opposite of harsh. Lee and his men were allowed to return home in peace instead of becoming prisoners of war. Officers were even allowed to keep their horses and weapons. This was the first part of Abraham Lincoln's plan to reunite the Union peacefully instead of seeking revenge. Even Confederate President Jefferson Davis was not tried or executed for treason against the United States. 5 days later, on April 14th, one of the most unexpected and devastating consequences of the Civil War occurred. President Lincoln was assassinated, shot in the back of the head while holding his wife's hand watching a play. The assassin, John Wilkes Booth, was a Southern actor angered over the Confederacy's loss. Lincoln's death made Andrew Johnson, his vice president, the new president. The United States would need to find its way through the post-war years without Lincoln's vision for the future. After 4 bloody years, the Civil War was over. It was a transformative event that marked a turning point between what the United States had been in its first century and what it would become going forward. The human loss was devastating. At least 620,000 Americans lost their lives in the war, although many historians believe the numbers were higher. In the 1860s, this number represented more than 2% of the American population at the time. Entire generations to come would be affected by these lost lives. The Union victory resolved 2 fundamental questions about the United States, which, until the war, hadn't had definitive answers. First, would the USA continue forward as one united nation? The answer was yes. The war settled the issue of secession once and for all. Since 1861, no American state has even made a semi-serious attempt to leave the nation. Today, Americans have the confidence that no matter what happens, their country will remain a United States. Second, would this country continue on its pre-Civil War course as the world's largest slaveholding nation? The answer was no. Before the war even ended, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution finished what the Emancipation Proclamation had begun. Slavery was abolished forever and for all time. The consequences of the war were very different in the South and the North. In 1865, large parts of the former Confederacy were invaded, destroyed, or occupied by Union soldiers. Major Southern cities, such as Atlanta, Georgia, and Richmond, Virginia, lay in ruins. It's estimated that 2/3 of Southern wealth was lost during the Civil War. Much of this wealth, of course, had been taken in the form of slaves who at the war's end were no one's property. 1/4 of Southern white men aged 20 to 40 had died in the war. Another 1/4 had been maimed, crippled, or had lost limbs. Before the war, the South had been in many ways the most powerful region of the United States. Now, parts of the South entered a period of political and economic decline that would last many decades or longer. With slavery ended, the entire social structure of the South was turned upside down. White and black citizens needed to find a new way to coexist as neighbors and countrymen. The situation in the North was very different. These states were largely untouched by war, as almost all Civil War battles took place in the South. The Northern economy was strong in 1865, fueled by wartime spending. During the war years, the size and power of the government had expanded greatly. Now, this bigger, stronger federal government would lead the nation in entirely new directions after the war. Most presidents had been Democrats and Southerners before the Civil War. Now, political power shifted to the North and the new Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln. 6 Union veterans, all of them Republicans, would become future presidents, beginning with Ulysses S. Grant. From 1860 to 1912, no Southerner would be elected president, and only one Democrat would be elected. Politically and economically, the North would be in the nation's driver's seat for quite some time. Another consequence of the Civil War was the passage of 3 constitutional amendments, all of which dealt with the new place of African Americans in the country. We already mentioned the 13th Amendment. It abolished slavery completely in the United States. The 14th Amendment clarified American citizenship, making it clear that African Americans, as well as all others born in the U.S., were Americans with all the rights that citizens possessed. This had been disputed before the Civil War. The 14th Amendment also guaranteed all Americans, especially former slaves, due process of the law and equal protection of the laws in every state. The 15th Amendment guaranteed the right of all citizens, especially former slaves, the right to vote. For African Americans, the Civil War was an especially transformative event. Before the war, most had been the legal property of someone else. Now, black citizens finally had the freedoms to work jobs of their choosing, to travel where they wished, to own property, and to form families without the fear of separation. Most black families remained in the South after the war. It was their home. Others left for the bigger cities of the North and the different job opportunities there. The Civil War did not end racism in America, of course, or reverse the consequences of slavery overnight. The period that followed that war, roughly spanning 1865 to 1877, is known as Reconstruction. The term represents the North's attempt to reform the South and ensure equal rights for the former slaves there by military occupation. Reconstruction was a period of successes and failures, but by its end, Southern states had largely found ways to ignore and disobey the 14th and 15th Amendments and the protections they guaranteed. African Americans in the South entered a new period of segregation and discrimination known as the Jim Crow era. For many black citizens of the United States, the Civil War would not truly be over for another 100 years until the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. One of the most remarkable things about the Civil War is that Americans were eventually able to reunite after a conflict that nearly tore their nation apart. It wasn't easy. The war left a bitter legacy for Americans on both sides. As years went by, veterans of the war reunited and formed organizations like the Grand Army of the Republic in the North and the United Confederate Veterans in the South. Battlefields like Gettysburg became protected sites, sacred ground for all Americans. Many of them are national park sites that you can visit today. A spring holiday known as Decoration Day began in the North, when the graves of veterans were decorated with flowers. It evolved into Memorial Day, a federal holiday we still celebrate today. As years turned to decades, bitterness yielded to a desire for reconciliation, the reunion and coming together of old enemies. In 1898, soldiers from the North and South fought together on the same side in America's war with Spain. Some older soldiers were veterans of the last war and may have faced each other as enemies more than 30 years before. The Pledge of Allegiance, which you may recite each morning at the start of school, is part of the Civil War's legacy. You can see it here in a slightly different version, as it was originally written in 1892. Have you ever wondered why Americans thought it was necessary to pledge allegiance, their loyalty, to their own nation? It has a lot to do with the Civil War. I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You can probably see how the pledge emphasizes that the United States is one nation that cannot be divided. It also stresses the rights and freedoms of all Americans, a key part of the war's legacy.